Over decades, frankly, defence spending has been cut and cut and cut.
I am proud to be the Chancellor that is delivering the biggest uplift in defence spending since the Cold War.
A 50% increase in the entire defence budget. It's not far off what we spend on schools. We all know we're going to need more planes, troops, cyber capability. Where the money is coming from is not at all clear.
This crisis in the Middle East has the potential to do even more economic damage and to increase the pain that people are feeling.
This makes it way harder to deliver the overwhelming thing that they have promised the British people, which is a significant increase in living standards.
Welcome to Talking Politics. I'm Paul Brand.
And I'm Robert Peston.
So we've got loads to discuss today because of the Chancellor's spring statement. We want to discuss the effect that the Middle East, of course, is having on energy prices, interest rates as well, and whether there will be further cuts this year, as some had been hoping for if they're homeowners. We'll talk about growth too. But first, Robert, let's talk about defence spending and the fact that she was increasing defence spending. But you've been spending time looking at the figures on this and whether we're even equipped to get any further involved in action in Iran, given the capacity of our armed forces.
Well, we were already stretched, frankly, in terms of our military capability, even before what's happening in Iran, just because over, decades, frankly, since the end of the Cold War, defence spending has been cut and cut and cut. We have got a government that is committed to significantly increase defence spending. The initial commitment was to 2.5% of national income, then 3% of national income by the sort of start of the next decade, and then 3.5%, the new NATO commitment by the middle of the next decade. That would be £30 billion of extra money that she'd have to find by the middle of the next decade, in real inflation-adjusted terms, or more than £40 billion in cash terms, right? That is a 50% increase in the entire defence budget. And that increase itself, it's actually more than we spend on, I think it's actually more than we spend on police and border force right now, as it were. It's not far off what we spend on schools. It's a lot. It's an awful lot of money. We all know we're going to need more planes, troops, cyber capability, because we've got the, obviously very expensive modern forms of warfare that are not just conventional weapons, but a lot of it is now cyber warfare. Where the money is coming from is not at all clear.
Yeah, we saw Emmanuel Macron announcing more nuclear warheads as well this week, didn't we? So it's clear that others are going through the same process across Europe. I mean, one thing she's not willing to give up is the fiscal headroom, which went up slightly this time in this spring statement. And again, she kind of weaved that into the broader political narrative, didn't she? Saying, look, this proves that the plan is working. We've got to stay the course. We've not got to, we can't be buffeted by, I don't know, the rise of reform or the rise of the Greens or pressure from the left to increase spending. She seems absolutely determined to stick to her fiscal rules. But it was interesting just how much the Middle East and the broader picture came up today. It's obviously going to affect the Chancellor's thinking. And a lot of the forecasts that she based today's statement on will date very, very quickly, won't they?
Well, no, they're already dated. And, the ABR has not adjusted its forecasts on the basis of the kind of market shocks we've already seen from Israel's and America's war on Iran, and then the wider conflagration in the Middle East. And in fact, one of the things, what I've got here is the Office for Budget Responsibility's Economic and Fiscal Outlook. It's the thing that's been published today. It's what the Chancellor was talking about. It has so-called conditioning assumptions, right? And these are the assumptions about what's going to happen to very core prices, for example, over the coming few years. One of its conditioning assumptions is that oil prices and gas prices would fall over the next 5 years compared to what they thought in November. That that assumption already,
What's the point?
is already looks foolish, and it's not the OBR's fault. That is what markets were predicting. That's what market prices were predicting. Futures markets, before this conflict started, right? Yeah. But it is a completely false assumption, and as a result of that assumption, it talks about how it expects inflation to reach target at the end of this year. Right,
2%.
2% target at the end of this year, because of quotes a loosening labour market and falling energy and food price inflation. Well, it doesn't look right now. We're seeing, the gas price absolutely go through the roof, and this is the gas price that European countries, including us, pay. Now, look, let's be clear. If this war somehow ended very fast, and what resulted at the end of that war was something that looked stable in the Middle East, maybe that gas price would fall again quite significantly. And therefore, maybe it wouldn't have the inflationary impact that we fear. Maybe it wouldn't feed through to what we all pay to heat our homes and cook. But right now, that gas price is through the roof. Oil prices are also up very significantly. I think over the last couple of days, something like 15% rise. That'll feed through to petrol prices. We are looking at, in terms of some of the basics of life for both people and businesses, a very significant increase in costs, which, doesn't render this set of forecasts irrelevant, but it does mean that certain elements of these forecasts are essentially sort of conditioning assumptions as the Chancellor works out how to react to this global crisis, rather than forecasts that she can rely on.
If we see this inflationary pressure from the war in the Middle East, presumably that reduces the chance of further interest rate cuts by the Bank of England this year, and then that feeds into household finances.
Yes, I mean, it's quite interesting to see the investors, in the way that they are pricing certain assets, have come to the conclusion, even now, that whereas they had expected there to be 2 further cuts of 0.25% in the bank's core interest rates, called bank rate. That tends to feed through to markets. So they were expecting something like another 0.5 percentage point. I mean, some economists were thinking we'd actually get more than that, 0.75 percentage point off interest rates by the end of the year. Markets are now pricing in only one of those interest rate cuts, so another 0.25% off interest rates, which, I mean, is better news for savers who, as you say, like higher interest rates, but, not brilliant news for those with big debts. I should say that the outlook for interest rates remains fairly uncertain. It hinges so much on when this war ends, how much damage has been done, for example, to... I mean, one of the reasons why the gas price is so much higher is because Qatar is a massive gas producer.
Yeah.
It is not, at the moment, shipping gas because of the uncertainties of how you transport it through the Straits of Hormuz. You've got pressure from China, very dependent on oil and gas coming through the Straits of Hormuz, putting pressure on nations there to open up traffic again, but we just don't know. At the moment, traffic is basically closed through there. So that's one of the reasons why the oil price is going up. That's why gas prices is going up. Very unclear, when traffic will increase again, when we can get this oil and gas out of there. That's number one. Number two, there have been attacks on oil production facilities. There are deep worries that there'll be further attacks by Iran, perhaps on gas production and oil production facilities. Were that to transpire, these rises in gas and oil prices would be sustained. Now, again, though, when it looks to central banks' decisions, Bank of England, European Central Bank, US Federal Reserve, the thing that they have to determine is this a one-off increase in the price level? Or is it going to feed through to other prices and become more inflationary, right?
Yeah.
Because the judgment about whether it's a one-off or fueling inflation more generally determines actually whether they even might ultimately put up interest rates. If it looked as though, against the background, for example, which doesn't seem to me to be the case, of a tight labour market, of a labour shortage, of people having the power to push up wages in response to increased prices, energy prices, that at that point you're in a really difficult position where central banks, it's not just that they slow down the cuts in interest rates, they actually might put them up. Now, for what it's worth, my judgment is that actually, particularly in the UK, right, we're seeing unemployment rise. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think we do have a tight labour market. Wages seem to be falling. The rate of increase in wages is falling a bit at the moment. So my view would be that to an extent, the Bank of England will look through the increase in prices, the inflationary impact. They will slow down the rate at which interest is cut, but they won't go into reverse and put interest rates up because, and this is bad news for all of us, the impact of putting costs up in that way and the blow to confidence that we all feel, whether you run a business or whether you're just an individual deciding what to buy, the blow to confidence will slow the economy down. Growth will be slower as a result of this. And that is bad news because lower growth, it ultimately means lower wages, lower tax rises.
Yeah. And I want to talk about growth in a bit more detail because that was one of the big macroeconomic pictures that the Chancellor had to pull out, of course, of these forecasts. Growth down this year, but up in the other years of this Parliament, which overall leaves it sort of neutral, doesn't it?
That's right.
It hasn't changed.
I mean this year, the OBR, so it says near-term, I'm going to read from the OBR's assessment. It says near-term cyclical weakness means we expect, that just means, near-term cyclical weakness, for those of us who don't understand these rates, it just means we're going through a slight bit of a downturn at the moment. Confidence not high, actually, at the moment. It says near-term cyclical weakness means we expect real GDP growth to slow from 1.4% last year to 1.1% in 2026. Now, most people would not think that 2025 felt like a boom year, right? Did not feel like a boom year to most people. And what they're saying is this year is going to feel a bit worse
than last year.
So that's not good news, right?
No, especially for a government that's pledged growth, that promised growth in the election.
But it does say that after that, it expects average growth quite a bit better. It's not time to crack open the champagne. If you remember from 92 to the financial crisis of 2007-8, right? Growth in that period was 2.7, 2.8% on average, right? Nudging 3%. The OBR has often been too optimistic in the past, but the OBR is saying it expects after this year growth for the following 4 years to average 1.6%.
Yeah.
Now that's 50%, bit less than 50% higher than growth this year. Right?
Still way below
but it's
that
still way below what
trend,
people were used to up until the financial crisis.
And actually, when I asked Keir Starmer about this in the election in 2024, I tried to pin him down on, because he kept talking about wanting growth, and I sort of asked him to quantify it. And he said somewhere between 2 and 3% would be what he would be aiming for. So, he's missing his own target here on growth.
And truthfully, if they could... they're doing nothing at the moment that makes me confident that they could get growth above 2%. But if they could get the growth rate above 2%, so many of the challenges, that both we as individuals face, so many people struggling to pay the bills, right? 2% growth leads to significant increase in living standards, right? So that would be one problem solved.
Yeah.
Equally, it just generates the kind of tax revenues that allow you to pay for better schools and better hospitals. And, we go back where we started. It helps you to pay for this massive increase in defence that we believe is necessary. But we're nowhere near seeing from this government a programme that would lead to that kind of growth.
So overall then, how do you think this leaves the Chancellor and her political position? Because, on the one hand, I suppose she's tied it into her narrative about slow and steady wins the race, let's not go off course, let's not break my fiscal rules. On the flip side, this crisis in the Middle East has the potential to do even more economic damage, and to increase the pain that people are feeling and the frustration they feel about the cost of living crisis. She's got to she's got to keep her hand on the tiller, of course, of all of this. How do you think she's faring politically?
So look, the backdrop to all of this is this concept of the vibe session, right?
Yeah.
Now, the reality is that wages have been rising a bit faster on average than the cost of living, than inflation, but people don't feel it, right? And I mean, there are millions of people at the lower end of the spectrum who are still really struggling to pay the bills, but on average, actually, people have been getting a bit better off, but nobody believes that. They don't feel it, right? And, you know, that is a massive political problem for this government. Keir Starmer switched the language of his big target, you know, at the end of the year, from growth is everything to actually getting the cost of living down is everything. And pretty much every time he's opened his mouth over the last, you know, 2 or 3 months, he said, my priority is to get the cost of living down.
Yeah.
Right? And so they announced, you know, one of the big things they announced was taking various costs for the green transition off bills that we pay for energy and putting it onto taxation. And, you know, therefore, we have all just experienced a bit of a cut in the price we pay for energy. The problem for him is this crisis, this war in the Middle East, is reversing all of that and adding more to bills, right? It is absolutely conceivable. There could be you know, in a few weeks' time, right? There could be a big increase in what we all have to pay for energy. It's not definite, but it's possible. So the question is, will voters give him the benefit of the doubt that he was trying to do the right thing, but nonetheless it's been wiped out by events beyond his control because he can't control Donald Trump, right? Or will they just say, actually, you never delivered anything good for us, and we still don't like you. So, you know, the truth is what's happening in the Middle East is really bad news for them because in the end, and we saw this with Joe Biden. So, I mean, Joe Biden, many people would say, did a lot of policies that strengthened or enacted a lot of measures in the US that strengthened the US economy and put the American people on a path to slightly higher living standards. The vast majority of Americans said they didn't feel it, didn't believe it, and he got voted out, right? And you know, in the end, the problem for you know, whether it's Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer is it's results that people want. And you know, this makes it way harder for both of them to deliver the overwhelming thing that they have promised the British people, which is a significant increase in living standards. And it's all very well for them to say it's not our fault. And to an extent, it is quite clear, well, not to an extent, you know, it is quite clear that the war in the Middle East is not their fault. But, you know, British, you know, in the end, voters, you know, the history of the history of elections is, if in the end you can't deliver it, right, voters tend to vote you out.
All right, Robert, let's see how things transpire over the next few days and weeks in the Middle East and how it continues to have political ramifications here. That's all for now. Thank you, Robert. If you haven't already subscribed on YouTube or any podcast platform, make sure you never miss an episode by doing so. Thank you for joining us.